This piece speaks to what I've been working on in my time in Washington, and I've been here for 3 months. And my whole subject has been about the relationship between sculpture and the wall. This is from the late 50s. This represents an endpoint almost for Henry Moore thinking about how he can work with the wall and how he can, in a way, get the better of the architect so that his sculpture is not secondary. And of course, Henry Moore, outside the East Building, is really present and plays off the wall, which was designed by I.M. Pei. And that has been interesting to me to think about how a sculptor responds to an architect. And it's always a difficult relationship. I know there was a story about where that piece should be, and they tried various sites for it. And in the end, it's in the place where Henry Moore wanted it. Originally, I.M. Pei had wanted it on the north facade.
Yeah. Are you satisfied?
Oh, I am.
Scale,
The scale is right.
Scale is right.
And I'm glad really, you see, this end. This end will be in light, and then this piece will be in the light.
Henry Moore, even when he was a young man in the 20s and 30s, was trying to find an important role for the sculptor, not to allow the sculptor to be subservient to the architect or the architecture. In the 1950s, he does a lot of work, 3 big projects that relate to the wall. First of all, in the early 50s in London, in Bond Street, on the Time Life building. And then he was invited by the Building Centre in Rotterdam to do a new wall for them. And he actually was told he had to work in brick. Henry Moore had never worked in brick, so there he really was sculpting a wall and working with bricklayers. And he made drawings which they cast in the bricks, in the moulds. And then these very professional and senior bricklayers made a fantastic job of building a wall for Henry Moore. Shortly after that, he was asked by the United Nations UNESCO committee in Paris if he would be one of the artists to contribute a new work to the UNESCO building. That was a big project, and in a way it was a big chance. Everyone's eyes were on Paris now. What was this all about? What was modern architecture? And how would modern architects work with modern artists? And they chose a range of different people, and Henry Moore was one of several. And in many ways, ultimately, the building was a kind of failure, because it seemed that it was so complicated to make it happen. It took so long that by the time it actually opened, it was old-fashioned already. But I think that one of the relationships that actually was salvaged through that project was between the architect Marcel Breuer and Henry Moore. And they were both pleased with the result. The sculpture that he made is not exactly this, but it's closest to the one in the centre, and especially this plinth or base that this form is sitting on is really quite like what he did in Paris. So I didn't even know that this work was in the National Gallery, but Nivola was already part of my project. Nivola is not very well known, even here, although he worked here for most of his life. This is not a typical piece at all, but I think it's very, very well placed. And also it really speaks to my story I'm telling you now, which is about the wall and about I.M. Pei and the idea of sculpture in front of architecture. Most of Nivola's work was cast in concrete, cement, sand, and it was integrated into the wall. In 1960, he began working with Eero Saarinen in Yale, and he did all the sculptures on the Morse and Stiles colleges in Yale. And those sculptures are interesting for me because they kind of emerge out of the wall. So they look as if they're made of the same material as the wall. Well, they are. They're cast with the wall at the same time with the same stones and the same concrete. This is almost the other way around. This is a carved work. But this is interesting, I think, because it really is right across between a wall and a sculpture. And the wall exactly echoes the way that I.M. Pei lays his stones, but neither of them are supporting anything. Neither of them are real walls, but they have this idea of the wall. And Nivola especially has the idea of a human being who's either emerging from the wall or imprisoned in the wall. And you can't quite work out whether you think that figure is kind of trapped in the wall or actually freeing herself from the wall. It talks very well about that tension between the flat surface and something emerging out of that flat surface. And it really is great next to the I.M. Pei cladding. Makes me, anyway, think about walls and how they relate to us and how we confront them, whether we kind of walk at them as if they were a screen or whether we think of them as something that is supporting a structure. In Washington, I've been looking a lot at walls, and at real walls and at fake walls, because this is a fake wall. It's not a real wall. So this cladding is just a little tiny surface. So what I've been thinking about is the relationship between sculpture and the wall, but also when is a wall and when it's not a wall? And when does the wall become more like sculpture? And I think that's, in a way, what Henry Moore is thinking about. Washington's turned out to be an amazingly good site for thinking about walls because of these big federal buildings. And you see these different changes in fashion. There's a whole period when they're clad in marble. And you can see different examples around here, the JFK Performing Arts Center, and the marble is always just a veneer, really. On the other hand, you have these really chunky buildings, like the FBI building or the Breuer buildings with these massive concrete facades, which are really sculptural in themselves. Of course, IMP had also used concrete a lot in earlier buildings and with earlier art galleries. But here on this site in Washington, he was compelled to use this cladding. He was told he had to, because Pope had used the cladding for the West Building. So one of the conditions for this whole project was that IMP should use the same marble, the Tennessee marble. This design, it's almost like a drawing rather than a wall, and how thin it is and insubstantial, and like an idea, really. And when you stand outside the building, it almost looks like it could float. I think it has an incredible lightness. It's so different from Marcel Breuer. And also what's unusual and completely different from the West Building is that the wall is exactly the same on the inside and the outside. So it has this kind of continuity. And that's very sculptural, I think. And then the question is, when does a building need a sculpture? And when does a sculpture need a building?
That piece will cast a shadow on that piece. You don't mind that?
No, that's part of it, yes.